key to learning.
Hello, this is Sekou Burmese, your host of The Lit Review, a podcast brought to you by the Academy of Management Journal. In this podcast, we dive into the insights of recent research published in the journal and interview authors and corporate leaders to discuss the inspiration for research ideas and how insights from this research apply to current pressing issues in organizations and markets. This episode, I speak with Kundro and Nancy Rothbard. Tim is an assistant professor of organizational behavior at the Kenan-Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina. Go Heels. Nancy is the David Pottruck Professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. In our conversation today, I talk with Tim and Nancy about their recent award-winning paper published in AMJ about gender, power, and moral objectors. The paper explores how power can protect moral objectors in organizations, but how this protection operates differently for men versus women. We discuss how a leader's morality is perceived within organizations and whether modern corporations are built to be amoral. I hope that you will enjoy this episode of The Lit Review and my discussion with Tim and Nancy. My guest today on the Lit Review podcast is Tim Kundro and Nancy Rothbard. Tim is an assistant professor of organizational behavior at the University of North Carolina and Kenan-Flagler Business School, and he studies the complexities of morality and ethics at work. Nancy is the David Pottruck Professor of Management and Deputy Dean, bigwig, at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Nancy studies what motivates people to bring their full selves to work and how this affects their work engagement, performance, and relationships. Now, both of these scholars are very accomplished. They've been recognized in the media by all of the top media places, but here today we are going to discuss their most recent paper, which was awarded as the best paper in AMJ for the year of 2023. Hello, Tim and Nancy, and welcome to the Lit Review podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Sekou.
All right, so I want to start off by diving into the paper. So the paper that won this illustrious award for 2023 is entitled, Does Power Protect Female Moral Objectors? How and when moral objectors' gender, power, and use of organizational frames influence perceived self-control and experienced retaliation. Now, it's a very concise, quippy title. No, there's a lot going on in the paper. We're going to unpack it. But before we get into the specifics, because the paper talks about gender and power dynamics as they are related to moral objection, which is taking action to oppose a questionable practice. Before we get into the paper, I want to ask, what got you both interested in the topics of either moral objection or these gender or power dynamics? Why was this a phenomenon that you felt was important to better understand with your research?
Yeah, for sure. So I started on this project with Nancy while I was a graduate student, which is kind of great to see it kind of make it through that process and then to be here and kind of have this published, which is fantastic. But I think at the time I was a grad student, and I remember talking with some of my advisors at Wharton about, this interest I had in morality and unethical behavior. And I think one of the things that I realized pretty quickly was that I wasn't necessarily interested in kind of understanding when and why people do these bad things in the workplace. I think that's an interest that a lot of people have in the back of their mind, but I was really interested in kind of how people do a lot of these really moral behaviors and kind of understanding the processes that people within organizations kind of take to kind of avoid some of these outcomes or kind of to raise opinions about these issues, or kind of looking at some of the downstream implications of kind of some of these broader behaviors out there. And one of these phenomena that I became interested in and saw in the literature was this idea of moral objection. And so this idea that oftentimes people see things in the workplace that they don't like, and they take these very strong moral stands to try to prevent them or to try to change the way in which people are behaving. And that was just a phenomena that kind of stuck with me for a little bit, and I became really interested in. And then I think talking with Nancy at some point, we realized that this was really applicable to the gender space. And so I think what we saw was that there was two prevailing perceptions in the literature. So on the one hand, there is kind of this perception that, maybe women, especially as they get into higher power roles, are likely to kind of continue to face backlash for speaking up about these moral issues. So maybe it's the case that we kind of don't give them the same legitimacy that we do for men, and that kind of even increasing in power isn't going to be beneficial for them. There's also this other perspective in the literature that kind of suggested the exact opposite, which is that actually when women get into these positions of power, they're going to be protected by their power roles. It's going to kind of shield them and kind of ensure that other people look at them in this legitimate way. And so I think that's where I started, at least with Nancy, and I'm sure she has some perceptions, at least from when we started talking about this idea a few years ago.
Yeah. What about you, Nancy? What drew you to this very interesting topic?
Yeah. So I remember Tim coming into my office with this idea, and he came in and he said, I have this idea about moral objection and women and all of this stuff. And there's this really interesting thing in the literature. And I was really fascinated because the first paper I ever published was a paper with Sue Ashford, Jane Dutton, and Sandy Pitteritt called Out on a Limb. And it was about issue selling. And it was about the challenge that women had in selling gender equity issues in organizations. So I had really had a long-standing interest in, what were some of the barriers to women being able to speak up in organizations and be able to voice challenging and difficult topics. And moral objection is a really difficult thing to voice, to speak up about. And so it was really linked to a long-standing interest I've had throughout my whole career, both from an academic standpoint, but then also what I've experienced in my career, right? As just sort of seeing my own experiences play out. And, it was just this wonderful kind of confluence of Tim's real passion for moral objection and things around morality in organizations, and, some of my interests as well. And so I just thought this was an amazing opportunity for us to collaborate on a really fun project that would hopefully resolve a conundrum in the literature. And what Tim just described is this really interesting conundrum. On the one hand, people think, all right, you get power and that protects you. But on the other hand, there's all of these gender dynamics, which suggest it doesn't necessarily work the same way for women. And so this was really fascinating because it just presented a real puzzle for us. But one of the things that I told Tim is I was really tired of just documenting the problems in the literature, and that if we were to do this paper, we had to find a solution. And that was my deal breaker, right, Tim?
Yeah, I remember that. And it was, it's kind of funny. I always talk about this with grad students here at UNC, that I think there's sometimes this push for grad students to work with people who kind of are in their wheelhouse and always study the exact same topics. And I think this is a good example of sometimes, the best collaborations are those where maybe you have these different perspectives and these different backgrounds. And I think, we were able to draw on both literatures, I think, to come up with a solution that was, I think, pretty interesting, obviously still grounded in theory, but then, practical as well too, right? Something that I think, like, when you talk with practitioners or you talk with the media, like, they're like, okay, I get that. That makes sense. That's something I can kind of see and feel. And I think is just intuitive appealing for that reason.
Yeah. All right. So that's a perfect segue into, let's talk about the paper. And I agree with you. A little behind the scenes, I was one of the judges on the committee for Best Paper. And so I got to read all of the papers that were published in 2023. And your paper rose to the top very quickly, in part because of addressing this conundrum that you said, Tim, just now, but also, Nancy, like you mentioned, that it's not just finding that there's an issue, but also finding and showing the proposed solution, which is really refreshing, particularly when you start studying things around gender and power and the like. So with that being said, what are the central findings that you want people to take away from this paper?
Yeah, so I think, so we kind of alluded to this debate, does power protect women in the same way as it does for men? What we find, at least in the archival data and in our recall study and study 2, is that the answer is no, right? So we kind of find support for these, role theory perspective that women, even in positions of power, are kind of viewed as incommensurate with those roles, and they kind of continue to face retaliation and backlash for engaging in moral objection. So then after that, we look towards some of the solutions, and what we kind of settled on was, perhaps the basis at which people face retaliation isn't just about the role that they have within the organization, but it's also kind of contingent on how they raise the moral objection. And so one thing that Nancy and I recognize is that a lot of the ways in which moral objections were talked about in the literature, and also I think when you look at these in the workplace, is that these tend to be fairly agentic, right? And so we term these as these standard moral objection frames where people take a moral stand because they personally feel as though some issue has personal relevance. And for this very, deontological view, we just can't stand for this moral behavior to kind of continue. Yeah. And what we found was that actually a lot of retaliation, regardless of gender and also regardless of power, so this also applied to lower powered men, when you frame your moral objection as benefiting the organization, so you talk about it with more of this utilitarian framing, because the moral issue could pose a threat or because it potentially could harm members of the organization. When you add a lot of this organizational language, we find that people don't face retaliation, again, regardless of their gender, regardless of their power. And our key mechanism here, at least in this paper, was looking at perceived self-control. So we kind of find that perceived self-control, this tendency to be viewed as kind of engaging in an action for yourself rather than others, kind of tied together all of these themes that we found when it came to not just gender and power, but also the framing effect that we found.
All right. So if I can make sure I get this, I'm a macro scholar, so I want to make sure I get the micro things down. The mechanisms are important. That moral objection or raising attention to something that you think is questionable in general is likely to face retaliation. Now that changes level and gender, which we'll go into some detail, but it sounds like the way you frame that moral objection, if you frame it as a collective, like the threat it has to the collective, that tends to lower the retaliation that people have towards raising moral objections.
So I think that was a beautiful summary, Sekou. One of the things that I would just say is people don't like moral objectors. They don't like hearing that something is morally wrong, and except if you're a high-powered man. So that is, it's just a quick clarification. In our archival study and in our recall study, we found this effect. So high-powered men are protected. People afford them the courtesy that they are doing this for good reasons.
Mm-hmm. So they have the benefit of the doubt, so to speak.
Exactly.
Got it. So I think this is really powerful and important, finding not only that there is this difference, but who gets the benefit of the doubt, who doesn't. And then obviously the framing, right? How you say things, which really can make the difference. And this is where I think, Tim, what you mentioned, that like practical sorts of advice is, the how you say something. Oh yeah, well, how you do say something does make sense, right? Sometimes you get negative feedback, and how the person gives you negative feedback can sometimes really change how you feel about the person. So it makes sense that it would also be the case with moral objection. Was there anything unexpected that you found as you were working on this paper? Any findings, any maybe interviews or stuff with the literature that you found that you thought was like, didn't expect to see that?
So one of the things, Sekou, that I think was really interesting here is that the mediating mechanisms, actually. Mm. So we tried a lot of the standard mediating mechanisms as controls for alternative explanations, and they didn't really predict in the way that I think that people expected. The mechanism that we looked at, which was this sort of self-control, perceived self-control, like is the person really in control of what they're doing? Are they doing this for organizational reasons? Are they kind of doing this on behalf of others? Are they other oriented? All of that was really part of the mechanism that we found. Mm-hmm. But what we didn't find was this sort of these alternatives like dominance and other kinds of mechanisms.
Right. So the more common explanations you think you would find for this difference, those didn't pan out. But this idea of self-control, when you say self-control, I think, are you running hot? Meaning, are you doing this in a reasoned sort of way, or are you kind of just, I can't take it anymore, I can't keep my mouth shut, I have to say this? Is that what you mean by self-control, or is it something different?
Yeah, so exactly. So I think that it's the impulsivity of it versus the control of it, right? So people who are kind of morally objecting to something, and you see them as not as being impulsive or self-oriented in what they're doing, that is associated with a lack of self-control, of perceived self-control.
So I found this aspect of the paper really interesting, right? This dilemma that apparently happens within organizations, which is someone may be saying the right thing, but maybe for the wrong apparent motivations, right? And this is kind of what I'm getting, that people are like, hey, what you're saying is true. That is, you're right to object to that, but man, you seem to be really personally troubled by this, and that motivation is what upsets some people. So, what do you think about that link between motivation and morality within organizations? Because I think moral things are things we get passionate about, but it sounds like there's maybe a penalty to that.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that's what's so interesting about this, right? So we take this observer perspective in this paper where you don't really know exactly what's going on in the person's head. You see them engage in these behaviors and you have to make these interpretations about their behavior. But I think, and we talk a little bit about this in the discussion, but yeah, it very well could be the case that, and it probably is the case that most people who raise these moral issues are doing it because they think it's the right thing, right? They're doing it because they see it as something that's moral. They're doing it is because they see it as something that needs to change. And odds are they're not doing it because they are, want to stir the pot or want to, cause trouble within the organization, so to speak. And I think, Jeff Goodwin has done a lot of good research on this, on how moral values and moral topics tend to be kind of top of mind for people. And they tend to be things that we're, hesitant to kind of break or bend on. And I think this intuitively makes a lot of sense, which could be why these moral objections are kind of so testy within organizations, right? We feel so strongly and so passionate about them that when we do raise them, we tend to use this kind of standard framing. I think that's something we saw in the recall study too, right? We were kind of looking in that data a little bit, at least in some of the open-ended responses, to see if people intuitively use these organizational frames. And if I recall correctly, I don't think we saw that people were using those that much, right? It tended to be the case that when people spoke about moral issues, they did so in like this fairly agentic way. And, I think if you think about why you would speak up about these issues to begin with, it makes a lot of sense. But then it kind of takes that extra step to kind of take a step back and think about how these issues might be perceived, especially if it's something that not everybody's going to endorse in the same way.
And just to clarify, when Tim's saying they do this in a fairly agentic way and a standard moral frame, what we mean is somebody says, that's just wrong. And they stop there. Right? Versus saying that's just wrong because it's going to really hurt our clients, our customers, our organizational members. It's going to hurt our business, right? We shouldn't be doing this because, and explaining the impact on the organization. Another thing that we found, by the way, was it wasn't just having a rationale that helped. It was having a rationale that was more organizationally oriented. And so that's why the organizational frame is really important. Saying, that's just wrong because I don't think that's what we should do doesn't help. Mm-hmm. Saying that's just wrong because something unrelated to the organization doesn't help, right? It has to be something that is related to the benefit of the collective that helps to diffuse this sense of self-orientation and impulsivity that people attribute to you when you kind of passionately say, that's just wrong.
Maybe I'm going to put you on the spot here, if you guys don't mind. What are some examples of common things that people morally object to in organizations? Because I think, stealing and, people think like awful things. Why wouldn't I be passionate? But I don't think you're thinking about those very extreme situations. Those aren't as common. So what are some examples of common events or behaviors that you find people tend to voice moral objection towards?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in the archival data, there was a few categories. It was talked about fairly broadly, so we don't exactly have specific topics in the same sense, but they were talking about things like disclosing health and safety dangers, right? And so this is something where you can probably see people falling on both sides of the aisle in terms of what's a health issue, what's a safety issue. Maybe some people have a different risk preference. You also saw things like refusing to obey an unlawful order. So what exactly do people interpret as an order that's unlawful? What exactly categorizes? Do regulations really fall into the same category? And then we also had this category of reporting unwanted sexual harassment and attention. And I think if our literature has painted any issue of that, it's that there's varying perceptions on what can classify or fall into those behaviors. And I think you can kind of see how those topics would also play out in a similar manner.
Yeah.
We also experimentally manipulated this idea of plagiarism in study 4 too, right? And so you can kind of see how there might be gray lines about what counts or what does not count as plagiarism. And so we're not really as keyed into the specific issue, I think, but we're more looking at these ideas where, there might be some disagreement. This isn't something that we're all going to fully agree with, but this is something that would be up for debate, and that somebody has some sort of preference or some sort of desire to kind of push other individuals to kind of align with their view of what's right or wrong, kind of in that sense.
What I would add is that people often morally object to things that they see as a problem that somebody else in the organization doesn't see as a problem. So, for example, you could think about from a strategy perspective, should we be entering this market, or not, right? Think about, issues with, different global types of regimes, right? Should we be doing business with this regime or not? It may not be illegal, but we may have a difference of opinion about it. We may morally object on certain grounds, right? So those kinds of things could be an issue. There could be things that have to do more internally with, how should we be doing hiring? Should we be giving people should we be doing interviews using a standard interview protocol, or should we be adapting? People might morally object to things saying, it's not fair if, right? So anything that somebody thinks it's not fair, that could be a moral objection. And there's all sorts of things that I think that we think aren't fair in organizations, right? How are we paying people in terms of raises? Are we doing, are we taking into account time in role versus the straight up performance rating? There's all sorts of differences of opinion people might have, and they could morally object and say this or that is not fair. Yep. And I think, Tim, would you say that that's consistent with your assessment of what kinds of things could constitute a moral objection?
Yeah, for sure. So I think we kind of, diverge a little bit from some of the 80s and the 90s perceptions of unethical behavior, where there's this very normative bent of right and wrong, and society agrees, and we're all on the same page. Whereas we're kind of saying, look, this is kind of in the eye of the beholder a little bit. These things can come up for a variety of reasons, and that's probably why they emerge in the first place. That's why this is an objection, and you're attempting to influence other people. Because they kind of need to be influenced because maybe they have a very different view. And so I think taking that holistic perspective was very indicative of how these things play out within organizations, but then B, also just super interesting. And I think kind of shows how pervasive these kind of topics are.
Yeah, no, that was great. I mean, and what really resonates with what you both kind of noted is that these are very gray, sort of up for grabs topics. These are not the clear-cut examples. And so as a result, you want to have discussion. And as part of that discussion, I think the morality of it has to come in. Whenever there's equity or fairness around, to tiptoe around the morality is sometimes not doing proper service to the importance of the topic. And so this is something I think we're seeing more and more, that organizations are having to deal with questions that border on fairness and morality. And so being able to do it in a way that's productive and does not to hurt certain populations is really key.
Yeah, and I just as one more example, as we were talking, I was thinking is, for example, accounting standards that you might use, or the way, the choices that people make, the accounting choices that organizations will make, are their choices. They make lots of assumptions, right? And then they get grilled on those assumptions by, by investors or what have you, and so, but you could see internally people raising objections to one way or another, and thinking through, what are the implications of this? And those are things that have, bottom line effect on organizations, but are things that are gray, right? In terms of how people make the choices that people make and how people feel about them internally. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a black and white, whistleblower type of event for this to be relevant.
All right, one more big question to ask you, and this one gets a little philosophical, so apologize in advance. And this is based on a conversation I had a friend of mine who's an organizational leader, and said something kind of jarring to me in passing, about corporations. And so she asked me, isn't the purpose of corporations so that people can disassociate their morals from their actions? This was not in jest. This was not sarcastic. She was really like, well, isn't that like the point, that the corporate is this, body that has no soul. And so you can just kind of make these very rational sorts of decisions without having to engage in the morality. And so I think I gave a very bad answer in response to that. And so I figured, since I have you guys here, maybe I can get your help to better answer this question. And so do you think that is the case with corporations and the allowance for amoral sorts of decision making? Or do you think that there's a different way that we would look at, ethics in corporations?
I think it depends. So that's super interesting. So this reminds me of Anne Tenbrunssel's work, where she's looked at the different way in which people approach some problems. Do they use a ethics mindset, or do they use a business approach? I think my answer is that I don't really know for sure. I think that, at least in a lot of my work, I'm really interested in kind of how people bring a lot of their moral values and a lot of their moral perceptions into organizations, right? And so I think if you look at, you can walk around the halls here and see the startups here at UNC or at different institutions, and you see a moral and ethical mission kind of behind a lot of those, right? You see what people are trying to come up with and what they're trying to do. And you see a lot of organizations I think start with this idea of having a positive impact and kind of perhaps solving this moral issue that exists in the world. I think organizations are challenging and they're messy, and some of these things can go awry, and maybe the act of organizing can kind of push us in one direction or the other. But, at least as a OB researcher, I like to personally think that that's not necessarily the case. I can see how these things get messy, but I can also see kind of the other side of the aisle and how organizations really, if done correctly, can kind of help solve and approach a lot of these issues that are just, so pressing and so important.
Okay. Nancy, what do you think?
So
you can't say it depends. You can't say it depends.
Well, no,
okay.
I actually think my whole research program on integration segmentation mindsets and people's preferences for integration or segmentation, I don't think that people can actually leave their morals at the door of organizations. And I think that that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that all of these challenges that are happening in the world right now are people are bringing their whole selves to the workplace and are having trouble with people who disagree with them. Mm-hmm. But it's because they can't just disassociate. They can't check all of these feelings and thoughts and just sort of become robots. Apple TV show Severance. People are always asking me, do I watch that? And I did. I finally watched it.
No spoilers. I'm not.
But you can't. We can't do that, right? We can't just leave who we are and walk in and become somebody else, right? Yep. And so I think that leaders can't do that either, right? Yep. And employees can't do that. And so we're having to modulate and regulate all of these things so that they're appropriate to the setting we find ourselves in. And but it's impossible to just assume that that's getting left behind and is somehow not in the mix of the decision making that we're making. What we know from psychology and from all the work on they're doing all sorts of fMRI imaging of people making decisions. We don't just separate our emotions and our cognition when we're making decisions, right? And so it gets modulated, but it doesn't. I don't think that it gets erased.
Gotcha.
So I think that's a fascinating but maybe stylized view of what organizations are.
Okay. All right. Stylized. I have to use that for the next time I get this question. No, that was very helpful. Okay. I'm going to send you off with these two last questions. These are fun ones. The first is, what sorts of phenomena are you drawn to now, right? I know a lot of the research in our field is trying to explain or understand phenomena that's out there that we're just hey, we don't have a good explanation for it. Is there anything that's happening, anything that you see within organizations that really intrigues you?
Yeah, so I teach business ethics here at UNC in the spring, and one thing I've been really interested in is this, perhaps attraction to and now kind of pushback against effective altruism. And so I've been thinking about this a lot recently where I think, there's this huge push towards EA, and a lot of people were kind of getting on board with some of the themes related to that. But I think perhaps in relation to what happened to SBF and kind of some of these like these very public tech figures who've kind of embraced EA and kind of turned people away from it, I've been really interested in kind of where people are going as a result of that. And so I've just been really kind of thinking about how some of these normative philosophies tend to kind of blend into this descriptive world and kind of think through how people are responding to these issues and, at all levels within the organization, right? So obviously, perhaps executives might be pushing a certain philosophical view of the world, and that could have implications. But I think you also see lots of, lower level employees thinking about these issues too, and this kind of playing a role in terms of what they're interested in. So kind of blending the two worlds. Yeah.
One quick follow-up. What is effective altruism? What does that mean?
So it's the idea that when we're thinking about what we should do and the right thing to do, we should attempt to maximize the goodness of a specific outcome. So you might think about this in terms of the charities that you could donate to. Should you donate to a charity that you're personally passionate about, or should you donate to a charity that is going to do the most good, if you could kind of categorize good as a specific unit? And so you can start to think about the different firms and kind of what they're doing, and are they, aligning themselves with a worldview that represents their own personal values, or are they kind of perhaps taking this more normative, seemingly more objective view? It's really interesting, kind of what kinds of people are attracted to those issues, and kind of how do people who aren't attracted to those issues kind of respond to those kinds of approaches?
All right, thank you. Okay, what about you, Nancy?
Well, so Tim and I, this paper was like the confluence of our interests, but I'm going to talk a little bit about divergence here. So I am and have been absolutely obsessed with how technology is changing the way we work and live, and how that's affecting our boundaries and all sorts of things about our relationships. And so I've just been absolutely trying to figure this out. I don't understand it, and I want to know. And so there's all sorts of different ways that this plays out. So online social media is one way. How do connection technologies affect the way that we're interacting with people at work? How does how do lots of these changes in our world affect the ways that we're relating to one another or not? And so that's just, it's been obsessing me for a while. And I think that the pandemic exacerbated some of that. And now post-pandemic, how are we settling back in? And I don't know. So I'm so interested in how this is affecting our boundaries and how we cross those boundaries and what goes across those boundaries and how that then plays out. And so in all sorts of ways. And I think that there's issues related to gender, there's issues related to, diversity. There's all sorts of issues that kind of all come together with this, but that's what I'm currently obsessed about.
You have no shortage of opportunities to study this as well. Okay, last question. What is something you are reading right now for fun? So no journal articles, Tim, no reviews, no student papers. What are you reading for fun?
You should ask Tim what he does for fun, because he actually does a lot of really cool things for fun.
You don't read. You do.
He might, but he does. But he's really interesting. He's a really interesting person.
All right.
So is that your attempt to save me from answering what I'm not reading right now?
Actually, I just think that you're such an interesting person.
That's good. That worries me that we're going to put this on a podcast, but that's good. Yeah. Are you alluding to mountain biking? Is that it, Nancy?
All of the things. Like, what did you just do? I couldn't get in touch with you when we were finalists for this award, because what were you doing?
Oh, I was backpacking in Olympic for 6 days, which was fun. So yeah, I got the email about and then I think, you called me, and we had just gotten into a town. I had a Olympic service, and I was like, hey, Nancy, I'll respond to this email in 3 or 4 days, but right now I don't have access to it. But yeah, no, I love the outdoors, and I'm super fortunate to be here.
Hanging off of a mountain.
I don't know about hanging, but I was
like Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible.
Something like that.
All right, I could see it.
So Nancy, are you reading anything for fun then? I'll throw this back on the spot for you.
Yeah, what are you reading for fun, Nancy? The world wants to know.
Oh, I read everything, Sekou. I read every day. I'm a very voracious reader. I'm reading mysteries. I'm reading science fiction. I'm reading.
So give me a sci-fi. Give me one of the more recent
uh,
sci-fis. I like sci-fi.
Oh, what was it's kind of like a sci-fi fantasy, like it's an alternative, like it's like it's this woman named Nalini Singh, and she writes these like alternative world kind of things. And then I'm reading this book by Alona Andrews, which is like this also alternative, like urban fantasy type of stuff. So I'm like
escapism.
oh, totally. That's the only way I survive.
All right. Oh, this is great. So Tim doesn't read. He just goes and hangs off mountains.
He reads, but
Nancy
he also, it's more interesting the fact that he hangs
Do you have
off
a book?
mountains.
Do you have a book that you read on your way to 6-day treks in the mountain?
So I read the guidebooks like front to back if I can, because I figure like, A, you're out of service, and then B, like it's such a narrative of like what people think about a place. It's kind of funny to see the history of it. So yeah, I'll
Guidebooks count. Guidebooks count.
I'm much more boring than he is.
Anything you read for fun counts. And this is a job where we have to read a lot for work. And so I'm always curious what people do when they are not working, but still want to consume something. I'm much more on the fantasy escapism side of things, Nancy. So I'm like that too. All right. Well, thank you both very much for joining me. Congratulations again on the award for Best Paper. This was a really great paper. I will recommend all of the listeners to check it out, to read it. There's also AOM did an insights based on it. So it's kind of an executive summary of the paper because it's also something that I think, as you both have mentioned, is really useful and practical for practice. So thanks, Tim. Thanks, Nancy. Appreciate it and hope to see you again at a conference sometime soon. Well, Tim, I'll see you in the hallway. But Nancy, I'll see you at a conference sometime soon.
Hey, thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, that's it for the Lit Review. I would like to give my thanks to Tim and Nancy for their time, and I appreciate you all for listening. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the Lit Review podcast. You can find us by searching The Lit Review and AMJ podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast platforms, as well as on the AMJ homepage. Please rate and review us. That helps us out a ton. You can also follow us on LinkedIn. We have a weekly show called the AMJ Radio Live, which is hosted on the Academy of Management LinkedIn account. Thanks to the Academy of Management for their support for this podcast. Special thanks to my producer, Holly Fearing, for all of her work behind the scenes. Our theme music is produced by Key to Life. This is Sekou Burmese. See you next time. Take care and be good.
Can I say one more thing, Sekou?
Please.
So the funniest thing is the story behind Tim and I sitting there in the AMJ editorial board meeting, because we walked in there and I said to him, oh, Tim, I think like that they must tell the winners like that they're the winners. So I think that we must not be the winners because we just got you're a finalist.
Uh-huh.
And then, right, Tim? I told you this. I was like, Tim, we just have to, like we should go, like blah, blah, but we shouldn't assume that we won. Because we shouldn't get our hopes up because I think that that's what they do. And he's like, okay. And so we're sitting there, and as they are describing the papers, right? Mm-hmm. The first paper was like he was waxing poetic about that first paper.
And it was an incredible paper, to be very
clear. It was a great paper.
I was like, this should definitely win. So yeah.
And Tim and I were looking at each other. We're like, oh, that's definitely winning, right? Like that is definitely winning. And then they go to the second paper, and we were still like, no, I think it's the first paper. And then he went to ours, and I think he was trying to downplay it or something, so he wasn't like going on too much about it. It must have been like in retrospect. I'm like, we're looking at each other. We're like, no way. I almost missed that we won because I was like thinking it was the first paper.
You weren't listening for your own name. You were like, wait,
listening, Tim, right? We were sort of like totally like, what?
I mean, and the other two papers were like phenomenal. So I heard the abstracts and the descriptions of them. I was like, oh, okay, cool. Like that totally makes more sense than this. But yeah, it was a pleasant surprise. So I'll definitely take it.
Well, I will let Georg, who does this and does wax poetic, I'll let him know that he totally duped y'all.
It was hilarious.
Which is good. I'm glad you didn't get up and leave, Nancy. That would have been
We were
awkward.
totally shocked. It was like the best Oscar-like shock face or something.